Hollywood is a pretty scary place right now. Blockbuster bombs with bloated budgets have put the squeeze on massive megacorps. Streaming sucked the blood out of theatrical revenues, only to be staked by profit-starved investors. New forms of on-screen entertainment are melting the brains of the next generation of mindless consumers. Even the workers are revolting. The movie business is in the midst of a painful metamorphosis, but even in times of turmoil and change, one genre has quietly kept things alive and thriving. Horror movies. They're about as old as cinema itself, and over the last 100 years, they've proven to be essential to the art and business of filmmaking in more ways than one.
You know, I think it's so universal. I think being scared is so universal.
Horror is a great access to an audience because people want to have a thrill.
That's what I do. I say I direct horror movies, and they're like, "Oh, I don't like horror movies." And I'm like, "Give me a break. You know, I haven't even tried it." You know, it's like saying you don't like fish or sushi or something. You know, it's like you haven't tried the right one.
Horror is an inherently, or at its best anyway, inherently creative genre. You know, you can really get extreme with it.
So, can horror save cinema from its decrepit state? It wouldn't be the first time. This is why horror is the most important movie genre. We tend to think of horror as disposable B-tier cinema, made on the cheap, full of cheesy effects and cliches. But horror lies at the very foundation of cinema itself, and since day one, horror films have always been a hotbed of new ideas, techniques, and technology.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Early cinema wasn't really about storytelling. People paid their hard-earned pennies just to stare at the images dancing in light. These films were more of an experience, an amusement park ride, as Marty would say, serving cheap thrills and visceral feelings. And it was only a matter of time before someone figured out how to instill what should be the easiest, most instinctive response of all: fear.
It's not just about what's on screen, it's what do you hear, what do you see, what do you not see, how can I do this scare with cinematography, how can I do it with editing.
1920s, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari stars a sleepwalking psycho who stabs people to death and is foiled by a final girl. There's even a twist ending. But Caligari's most important contributions to film are in the stylized sets and twisted architecture that inform every frame of the picture. The winding forests and claustrophobic cabins are purposely crafted to place the viewer in the mind frame of a madman. It was the first horror film that looked the way it wanted to make you feel. 2 years later, F.W. Murnau directed Nosferatu, an extremely unlicensed adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And while the visuals are a little more grounded than the nightmare of Caligari, the techniques introduced have become inseparable from the language of cinema. Monsters cast impossible shadows as they slink across sets and scenery. Figures are framed within windows and stone arches to emphasize isolation and power. Brief cuts to unsettling images will become today's jump scares and subliminal imagery. These two films didn't just introduce horror tropes to cinema, they laid the building blocks for modern editing, cinematography, and production design while introducing audiences to the concepts like atmosphere and tension. Every film noir detective lurking in the city shadows, every askew angle of a Tim Burton movie, and every surreal David Lynch nightmare owe a debt to these two films, and to horror as a whole.
You can find horror in so many non-horror movies. If I watch a movie like In Cold Blood again, there's sequences within that are as terrifying as any spectacular horror movie. These are movies that get into your body in a primal way.
The brilliant makeup artistry of Lon Chaney laid the groundwork for Tom Savini's gruesome prosthetics. Shambling men in sweaty suits evolved into the dripping rubber monstrosities of Stan Winston and Rob Bottin. In-camera illusions paved the way for far more complex computerized creations. More importantly, horror is where filmmakers figured out how to do all these things on a budget. Horror movies have largely stayed away from the excesses of modern-day blockbusters, and for good reason. You just don't need a lot of money to scare people.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Star salaries are skyrocketing in a post-monoculture world. Big films are designed by committee to be broadly appealing, so arrogant execs feel comfortable throwing money away on endless reshoots. Special effects are looking worse and costing more than ever. Movies have gotten really, really expensive. Superhero films, animated movies, even somber Scorsese crime procedurals are all costing in the $200 million range these days, and they're not exactly blowing the roof off the box office like it's 2018. So thank Black Phillip for the one scrappy genre that consistently punches above its weight class and brings home the bacon without breaking the bank.
We have so much content. People are looking for experiences, and sometimes that means, planets blowing up on screen, and sometimes that means just being in an intimate setting, really, really scared.
The highest budget horror movie of all time is World War Z at $190 million. Now, the movie was a minor success and surely sold a lot of Pepsi, but for most scary movies, the math just doesn't add up. Horror has always been a game of minimum spending to maximize profits, and it's helped keep cinema alive through thick and thin. Universal's Dracula saved the studio and kicked off a golden age of monster mania in 1931, but the movie itself is basically a filmed play with few sets and no special effects. Bela Lugosi only got paid $3,500. Even Karloff made more than that.
Karloff does not deserve to smell my shit!
Throughout the 40s and 50s, the studio system churned out cheapo horror flicks as inexpensive matinee fodder, mainly for kids.
Back in the day, the studio executives, they sort of looked down their nose at. It was because it was not something they could dine out on. It was, you always got the impression they were a little, not embarrassed by it, but, it just wasn't their thing.
But the 60s brought with them an independent film revolution that allowed filmmakers to follow their own rules, shatter taboos, and make a lot of money on lean productions. In 1968, Pittsburgh filmmaker George Romero clawed together $114,000 to make Night of the Living Dead, and used every trick in the book to stretch it as far as he could. Grocery store chocolate syrup simulated blood, while zombies chowed down on donated meat from an investor who just so happened to own a butcher shop. And since Romero couldn't afford color film, he shot it in black and white. The movie grossed $30 million, over 260 times its budget. A few years later, Tobe Hooper began filming the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with only $60,000. He couldn't afford to replace the actors' blood-drenched costumes even when they started stinking in the Texas heat. And when he found out how expensive plastic skeletons were, he decided to dress his sets with real human bones. It too made $30 million. The low-quality, high-contrast film stock in Night of the Living Dead gives it an almost found-footage documentary feel, while the amateur acting and sweaty atmosphere makes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre feel like a snuff film. Tiny budgets didn't keep people away from the theater and made the movies better, and it still does today.
It forces you to be creative. It forces you to really bring artistry to it, to do it in a unique or refreshing way if you're going to be effective about it.
Horror is scary because it feels like it's infiltrating your everyday. And I think to feel grounded, you don't need a $50 million budget or whatever it is. It's like you want to feel like you and I are talking and then something can burst in. It's like the aesthetic of keeping it real, I think, keeps those budgets in check.
You don't see too many horror flicks shot on an LED volume. Sure, there's a lot of scary bad CGI out there, but horror is still where the best practical effects get to shine. Heck, practical effects might only be around today because horror has kept them alive out of frugal necessity. A 70s grindhouse horror would eventually be refined into the slightly more tame but even more profitable subgenre we call slashers. Halloween cost $300,000 and made $70 million. Friday the 13th cost $500,000 and made $60. Nightmare on Elm Street made so much money for a failing New Line Cinema that the studio became known as the house that Freddy built, which means without horror films, we wouldn't have Lord of the Rings or the best Ninja Turtles movie. Today, the bar for entry is even lower. Anyone can make a horror movie. Anyone. Even these guys.
People are seeing huge profits with these digital horror movies. Douchebags who never made a film before.
That Saw thing? $400,000 to make, took in $100 million worldwide.
Obviously, the vast majority of modern no-budget movies are going to reach their ceiling streaming on Tubi. But when an inexpensive horror movie hits, it hits big. It cost the Blair Witch Project $60,000 to tie some sticks together and strand some college kids in the woods with cameras. They earned $250 million worldwide, 4,000 times what they started with. Paranormal Activity, a film whose special effects include slamming doors and time-lapse photography, was filmed in 7 days for $15,000 and made $194 million, giving birth to the empire known as Blumhouse. The production company's MO is to offer a diverse lineup of talent, somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million, to create unique films with a lower profit floor and a much, much higher ceiling. Minimal risk, maximum reward is the Blumhouse philosophy, and it's done them extremely well so far. From The Purge and Happy Death Day to The Black Phone and Mithrigan.
What are you doing?
Blumhouse definitely had their misses, most recently with The Exorcist Believer. The disappointing box office definitely had to sting after they made the curious decision to partner with Universal and buy the rights to the series for $400 million. To put that in perspective, $400 million is what Blumhouse spent on all their other films combined, and they've made a lot of movies. Disney spent that much making just one Star Wars, and even though The Force Awakens brought in a cool $2 billion, that's nothing compared to the combined $5 billion gross that Blumhouse has accumulated. It's a winning formula, and not just at the box office. Horror movies keep Hollywood fresh as a beating source of new blood. Horror's DIY spirit is a boon to the business side of movies, but it's about more than just money. It's about the future. Since money's so tight, there's not much available to spend on above-the-line costs like A-list talent. But since there's so little upfront monetary risk, producers can save some scratch by taking chances with untested, inexpensive new talent.
One of the things that horror's done, I think, is it's attracted so many great young filmmakers. You don't necessarily need Tom Cruise. You don't need Tom Hanks.
Actors are the most obvious. Pretty much every thespian worth their salt was either murdered in a horror movie or witnessed one on Law & Order. Julia Louis-Dreyfus was in Troll, future Scorsese muse Leo DiCaprio debuted in Critters 3, and Crispin Glover was a tour de force in Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, just to name a few. Hey, a gig is a gig, even if they are just more meat for the grinder, but actors aren't the only ones making their bones in horror movies. Behind the camera, horror films serve as the training ground for new generations of Hollywood heavyweights.
A bucket of blood.
No, you're gonna shoot me! Don't shoot!
King of the B-movies Roger Corman brought assembly line efficiency to film production, and the hundreds of mostly terrible films he produced under intense deadlines and microscopic budgets served as a de facto film school for countless Hollywood icons.
I hope he knows that this is not all hot air. I'm gonna cry now.
Francis Ford Coppola of The Godfather and fathering Sofia Coppola fame was a lowly editor of softcore porn until Roger Corman hired him to help make horror flicks.
I was sort of an assistant for Roger Corman, and I learned much from him about how to make a movie in his method, which is low budget, low budget, low budget, not to waste a nickel on anything unnecessary.
After one film came in under budget, Corman offered Coppola the leftover funds to make a movie of his own, Dementia 13. James Cameron is another Corman grad, beginning as a special effects model maker and working up the ladder on horror films like Piranha and Galaxy of Terror. When the director of the Piranha sequel bailed, Cameron seized the opportunity.
Piranha 2, Flying Killers.
Piranha 2 probably was not his ideal debut, but the practical philosophy that Cameron learned from cheapskate Corman horror films served him throughout his career. From using identical twins instead of special effect duplicates whenever possible, or making 8 xenomorph costumes seem like hundreds through clever editing in Aliens.
James Cameron got the idea to shock the maggots. That's how they started squirming. He was amazing. He was always coming in with his, again, Roger Corman finding the most brilliant minds.
Working in Roger's filmmaking environment teaches you is that there's always a way to do it.
Cameron might not be so concerned about budgets today, but he paid his dues in the salt mines of horror like so many before and since. Modern masters like Ari Aster, Ty West, and Jordan Peele got their start as directors in horror and became legends in the space. Others got their foot in the door with horror and brought its unique sensibilities into other genres. Sam Raimi's unhinged camera moves from Evil Dead translated to the dynamic comic book camp of his Spider-Man films. Catherine Bigelow's big break was vampire western Near Dark, where she developed the trademark kinetic violence she'd bring to action movies like Point Break. Troma alumnus James Gunn introduced goofiness and gore to his superhero movies by way of Slither. The list goes on and on. Making a horror film is almost a rite of passage in Hollywood, a blood-soaked baptism that gives new talent every lesson for success.
Horror is one of those things where you can come into it thinking about how to use every tool in the filmmaker's arsenal.
I think specifically with horror, because it is so visual, you have to create a mood and an atmosphere and an intensity in a way that you don't necessarily have to in other genres, because it's all about building.
Horror teaches you to be lean and make the most of what you have. It teaches you to favor tension and mystery over shaky special effects, and it keeps filmmakers focused on the audience above everything else.
You're not taught to think about the audience a lot in film school. Horror movies, you have to really think about the audience, how to scare them, how to get them to react, how to make their blood pump. And so I think making a horror movie, you learn to see what you're making from the point of view of the audience in a way that you don't in film school.
Fresh meat keeps horror from growing stale, but that's not the biggest reason it's remained popular. Horror can be anything you want it to be. Horror is the one genre that's truly universal. Have you ever heard anyone arguing about whether horror fatigue is real? I doubt it. Horror might be the most flexible genre there is, and its consistency and longevity is directly related to its adaptability, especially how it evolves to reflect the fears of society.
I think that, the best horror, use your horror concept as a metaphor for something. Ideally, as a metaphor for something that's going on in the world that will speak to the audience.
Horror movies in the 30s were vaguely Christian morality tales warning of an unwelcome other. By the 50s, this was replaced by atomic anxiety and Cold War paranoia. The growth of suburbs and boomer safetyism of the 70s are reflected in slasher films, and the burgeoning women's liberation movement and Roe v. Wade gave birth to movies like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Omen. The 80s were all about excess, as studios exploited big franchises, while cheap video nasties maintained horror's shocking edge.
Research is taking place, and it will show that these films not only affect young people, but I believe they affect adults as well.
I prefer horror films.
Why is that?
Because they're more scarier, more threatening, and more blood.
The 90s looked back on horror with an end-of-history snarkiness until the post-9/11 new millennium ushered in an age of torture porn that tried to make sense of a senseless war on terror. As for today, it's hard to find a single issue that meets our particular messed up moment. Peele's Get Out and Nia DaCosta's Candyman use horror to explore issues of race and identity, while films like Hereditary unpack grief and generational trauma. But maybe modern horror movies aren't defined by what they're saying, but how they're made. And more often than not, horror films are low-status sludge, but every once in a while, the genre gets a jolt of prestige. In the 70s, Jaws and Alien transformed monster movies into blockbusters. Later, Silence of the Lambs would prove that horror flicks were worthy of Oscar glory. Today's elevated horror films follow in the same footsteps. While the big studios are blowing billions chasing a cinematic universe, horror has filled the gap for moviegoers looking for something a little more cerebral.
Horror genre in general is really just taken much more seriously than it used to be. And that has been a huge, advantage and boon for anyone in my position who does this, because they're legitimately enthusiastic about it.
Low-budget modern gore fests like Terrifier very much have a place, of course. There's plenty of room at the table for all kinds of horror subgenres, both domestic and foreign. Horror is a language spoken around the globe, nearly every culture enriching it with their own folklore and flavor. English horror films are traditionally reserved and elegant. Italian giallo is a vivid feast for the senses. Japanese and South Korean horror focuses on vengeful spirits and exquisite suffering. Every territory influences the other, chasing old trends and creating new ones. The days of scouring eBay for a bootleg copy of Tetsuo the Iron Man are long gone. Today, imported horror is a big business, with the at minimum horror adjacent Squid Game topping the charts as Netflix's most watched content ever, #1 in 94 different countries. Even if you don't speak the language, horror is effective through imagery and sound alone. It's the purity of cinema laid bare.
Everyone can relate to it. Everyone has been scared and can be scared, and that experience is really exhilarating, especially when it's calibrated right, when you have like the right experience.
Horror isn't the most important film genre because it's innovative or inexpensive. It's not because of the boundaries it pushed or the talent it incubated. Horror is the most important film genre because it's flexible enough to reflect the times, the tastes, and the traditions of the entire world. No matter who you are, no matter where you live, or what you're into, odds are you're afraid of something. And as long as movies exist, so will horror.